Alright, we're back. Love in the Time of Cholera, middle of chapter 4, page 195. They've just talked about this poetry competition that the Chinese man won that Florentino also had entered in. Alright, middle of 195. Florentino Ariza always associated that scandalous event with the memory of an opulent stranger who sat beside him. He had noticed her at the beginning of the ceremony, but then had forgotten her in the frightful suspense of anticipation. She attracted his attention because of her mother-of-pearl whiteness, her happy plump woman's scent, her immense soprano's bosom crowned by an artificial magnolia. She wore a very close-fitting black velvet dress, as black as her eager warm eyes, and her hair, caught at the nape of her neck with a gypsy comb, was blacker still. She wore pendant earrings, a matching necklace, and identical rings shaped like sparkling roses on several fingers. A beauty mark had been drawn with a pencil on her right cheek. In the din of the final applause, she looked at Florentino Ariza with sincere grief. "Believe me, my heart goes out to you," she said to him. Florentino Ariza was amazed, not because of the condolences, which he in fact deserved, but because of his overwhelming astonishment that anyone knew his secret. She explained, "I knew because of how the flower trembled in your lapel as they opened the envelopes." She showed him the velvet magnolia in her hand, and she opened her heart to him. "That is why I took off mine," she said. She was on the verge of tears because of his defeat, but Florentino Ariza raised her spirits with his instincts of a nocturnal hunter. "Let us go somewhere where we can cry together," he said. He accompanied her to her house. At the door, since it was almost midnight, and there was no one on the street, he persuaded her to invite him in for a brandy while they looked at the scrapbooks and photo albums containing over 10 years of public events which she had told him she owned. It was an old trick, even then, but this time it was guileless, because she was the one who had talked about her albums as they walked from the National Theatre. They went in. The first thing Florentino Ariza observed in the living room was the door to the only bedroom was open, and that the bed was huge and luxurious, with a broad brocaded quilt and a headboard with brass foliage. That disturbed him. She must have realized it, for she crossed the living room and closed the bedroom door. Then she invited him to sit down on a flowered cretonne sofa with a sleeping cat lying there, and she placed her collection of albums on the coffee table. Florentino Ariza began to leaf through them in an unhurried way, thinking more about his next step than about what he was seeing. And then he looked up and saw that her eyes were full of tears. He advised her to cry her heart's content and to feel no shame, for there was no greater relief than weeping, but he suggested that she loosen her bodice first. He hurried to help her, because her bodice was tightly fastened in the back with a long closure of crossed laces. He did not have to unlace them all, for the bodice burst open from the sheer internal pressure, and her astronomical bosom was finally able to breathe. Florentino Ariza, who had never lost the timidity of a novice, even in comfortable circumstances, risked a superficial caress on her neck with the tips of his fingers, and she writhed and moaned like a spoiled child and did not stop crying. Then he kissed her on the same spot just as softly, and he could not kiss her a second time because she turned toward him with all her monumental body, eager and warm, and they rolled in an embrace on the floor. The cat on the sofa awoke with a screech and jumped on top of them. They groped like desperate virgins and found each other any way they could, wallowing in the torn albums, fully dressed, soaked with sweat, and more concerned with avoiding the furious claws of the cat than with the disastrous love they were making. But beginning the following night, their scratches still bleeding, they continued to make love for several years. When he realized that he had begun to love her, she was in the fullness of her years. He was approaching his 30th birthday. Her name was Sara Noriega, and she had enjoyed 15 minutes of fame in her youth when she won a competition with a collection of poems about love among the poor, a book that was never published. She was a teacher of deportment and civics in the public schools, and she lived on her salary in a rented flat in the motley Sweethearts' Mew in the old Gethsemane district. She had had several occasional lovers, but none with intentions of matrimony, because it was difficult for a man of her time and place to marry a woman he had taken to bed. Nor did she cherish that dream again after her first formal fiancé, whom she loved with the almost demented passion of which one is capable at the age of 18, broke the engagement 1 week before the date they had set for the wedding, and left her to wander in the limbo of abandoned brides, or of used goods, as they used to say in those days. And yet, that first experience, although cruel and short-lived, did not leave her bitter. Rather, she had the overwhelming conviction that with or without marriage, or God or the law, life was not worth living without a man in her bed. But what Florentino Ariza liked best about her was that in order to reach the heights of glory, she had to suck on an infant's pacifier while they made love. Eventually, they had a string of them in every shape, size, and color they could find in the market, and Sara Noriega hung them on the headboard so she could reach them without looking in her moments of extreme urgency. Although she was as free as he was, and perhaps would not have been opposed to making their relationship public from the first, Florentino Ariza considered it a clandestine adventure. He would slip in by the back door almost always very late at night and sneak away on tiptoe just before dawn. He knew as well as she that in a crowded and subdivided building like hers, the neighbors had to know more than they pretended. But although it was a mere formality, that was how Florentino Ariza was, how he would be with all women for the rest of his life. He never made a slip with her or with any other woman. He never betrayed their confidence. He did not exaggerate. On only one occasion did he leave a compromising trace or written evidence, and this might have cost him his life. In truth, he always behaved as if he were the eternal husband of Fermina Daza, an unfaithful husband, but a tenacious one, who fought endlessly to free himself from his servitude without causing her the displeasure of betrayal. Such secretiveness could not flourish without misapprehensions. Transito Ariza died in the conviction that the son she had conceived in love and raised for love was immune to any kind of love because of his first youthful misfortune. But many less benevolent people who were very close to him who were familiar with his mysterious character and his fondness for mystic ceremonies and strange lotions shared the suspicion that he was immune not to love but only to women. Florentino Ariza knew it and never did anything to disprove it. It would not worry Sara Noriega either. Like the countless other women who loved him, and even those who gave and received pleasure without loving him, she accepted him for what he really was, a man passing through. She eventually showed up at her house at any hour, or he eventually showed up at her house at any hour, above all on Sunday mornings, the most peaceful time. She would leave whatever she was doing, no matter what it was, and devote her entire body to trying to make him happy in the enormous mythic bed that was always ready for him, and in which she never permitted the invocation of liturgical formalisms. Florentino Ariza did not understand how a single woman without a past could be so wise in the ways of men, or how she could move her sweet porpoise body with as much lightness and tenderness as if she were moving underwater. She would defend herself, saying that love, no matter what else it might be, was a natural talent. She would say, "You are either born knowing how, or you never know." Florentino Ariza arrived with retrogressive jealousy, thinking that perhaps she had more of a past than she pretended, but he had to swallow everything she said because he told her, as he told them all, that she had not been his only lover. Among many other things that he did not like, he had to resign himself to having the furious cat in bed with him, although Sara Noriega had his claws removed so he would not tear them apart while they made love. However, almost as much as rolling in bed until they were exhausted, she liked to devote the aftermath of love to the cult of poetry. She had an astonishing memory for the sentimental verses of her own time, which were sold in the street in pamphlet form for 2 centavos as soon as they were written. And she also pinned on the walls the poems she liked most, so that she could read them aloud whenever she wished. She had written versions of the deportment and civic texts in hendecasyllabic couplets, hendecasyllabic couplets, like those used for spelling, but she could not obtain official approval for them. Her declamatory passion was such that at times she continued to shout her recitation as they made love, and Florentino Ariza had to force a pacifier into her mouth, as one did with children, to make them stop crying. In the plenitude of their relationship, Florentino Ariza had asked himself which of the two was love, the turbulent bed or the peaceful Sunday afternoons, and Sara Noriega calmed him with the simple argument that love was everything they did naked. She said spiritual love from the waist up and physical love from the waist down. That's really nice. Sara Noriega thought this definition would be good for a poem about divided love, which they wrote together and which she submitted to the 5th Poetic Festival, convinced that no participant had ever presented such an original poem, but she lost again. She was in a rage as Florentino Ariza accompanied her to her house. For some reason she could not explain. She was convinced that Fermina Daza had plotted against her so that her poem would not win first prize. Florentino Ariza paid no attention to her. He had been in a somber mood ever since the awarding of the prizes, for he had not seen Fermina Daza in a long time, and that night he had the impression that she had undergone a profound change. For the first time, one could tell just by looking at her that she was a mother. This came as no surprise to him, for he knew that her son was already in school. However, her maternal age had never seemed more apparent as it did that night, as much for the size of her waist and the slight shortness of breath when she walked as for the break in her voice when she read the list of prize winners. In an attempt to document his memories, he leafed through the albums of the poetic festivals while Sara Noriega prepared something to eat. He saw magazine photographs and color yellowing postcards of the sort sold in arcades for souvenirs, and it was a kind of ghostly review for the fallacy of his own life. Until that time, he had maintained the fiction that it was the world that was changing, and customs and styles, everything but her. And that night, he saw for the first time in a conscious way how Fermina Daza's life was passing, and how his was passing, while he did nothing more than wait. He had never spoken about her to anyone because he knew he was incapable of saying her name without anyone's noticing the pallor of his lips. But that night, as he looked through the albums as he had done on so many other evenings of Sunday tedium, Sara Noriega made one of those casual observations that freeze the blood. "She's a whore," she said. She said it as she walked past him and saw a print of Fermina Daza disguised as a Black Panther at a masquerade ball, and she did not have to mention anyone by name for Florentino Ariza to know who she was talking about. Fearing a revelation that would shake his very life, he hurried to a cautious defense. He objected that he knew Fermina Daza only from a distance, that they had never gone further than formal greetings, that he had no information about her private life, but was certain she was an admirable woman who had come out of nowhere and risen to the top by virtue of her own merits. "By virtue of marrying a man she does not love for money," interrupted Sara Noriega. "That's the lowest kind of whore." His mother had told Florentino Ariza the same thing, with less crudeness, but with the same moral rigidity, when she tried to console him for his misfortunes. Shaken to the very core, he could find no appropriate response to Sara Noriega's harshness, and he attempted to change the subject, but Sara Noriega would not allow that to happen until she had given vent to her feelings. In a flash of inspiration that she could not have explained, she was convinced that Fermina Daza had been the one behind the conspiracy to cheat her of the prize. There was no reason to think so. They did not know each other, they had never met, and Fermina Daza had nothing to do with the decision of the judges, even though she was privy to their secrets. Sara Noriega said in a categorical manner, "We women intuit these things." And that ended the discussion. Near the bottom of 200. From that moment on, Florentino Ariza began to see her with different eyes. The years were passing for her too. Her abundant sexuality was withering. Without glory, her love-making was slowed by her sobbing, and her eyelids were beginning to darken with old bitterness. She was yesterday's flower. Besides, in her fury at the defeat, she had lost count of her brandies. It was not her night. While they were eating their reheated coconut rice, she tried to establish how much each of them had contributed to the losing poem, in order to determine how many petals of the golden orchid would have gone to each one. This was not the first time they had amused themselves with Byzantine competitions, but he took advantage of the opportunity to speak through his own newly opened wound, and they became entangled in a mean-spirited argument that stirred up in both of them the rancor of almost 5 years of divided love. At 10 minutes before 12, Sara Noriega climbed up on a chair to wind the pendulum clock, and she rested on the hour, perhaps trying to tell him, without saying so, that it was time to leave. Then Florentino Ariza felt an urgent need to put a definitive end to the loveless relationship, and he looked for an opportunity to be the one to take the initiative, as he would always do, praying that Sara Noriega would let him into her bed so that he could tell her no, that everything was over. He asked her to sit next to him when she had finished winding the clock, but she preferred to keep her distance in the visitor's easy chair. Then Florentino Ariza extended his index finger, wet with brandy, so that she could suck it, as she had liked to in the past, during their preambles to love. She refused. "Not now," she said. "I'm expecting someone." Ever since his rejection by Fermina Daza, Florentino Ariza had learned to always keep the final decision for himself. In less bitter circumstances, he would have persisted in his pursuit of Sara Noriega, certain of ending the evening rolling in bed with her, for he was convinced that once a woman goes to bed with a man, she will continue to go to bed with him whenever he desires, as long as he knows how to move with her to passion each time. He had endured everything because of that conviction. He had overlooked everything, even the dirtiest dealings in love, so that he would not have to grant to any woman born of woman the opportunity to make the final decision. But that night he felt so humiliated that he gulped down the brandy in a single swallow, doing all he could to display anger, and left without saying goodbye. They never saw each other again. The relationship with Sara Noriega was one of Florentino Ariza's longest and most stable affairs, although it was not his only one during those 5 years. When he realized that he felt happy with her, above all in bed, but that she would never replace Fermina Daza, he had another outbreak of his nights as a solitary hunter, and he arranged matters so that he could portion out his time and strength as far as they would go. Sara Noriega, however, achieved the miracle of curing him for a time. At least now he could live without seeing Fermina Daza, instead of interrupting whatever he was doing at any hour of the day to search for her along the uncertain pathways of his presentiments, on the most unlikely streets, in unreal places where she could not possibly be, wandering without reason, with a longing in his breast that gave him no rest until he saw her, even for an instant. The break with Sara Noriega, however, revived his dormant grief, and once again he felt as he did on those afternoons of endless reading in the little park, but this time it was exacerbated by his urgent need for Dr. Juvenal Urbino to die. He had known for a long time that he was predestined to make a widow happy, and that she would make him happy, and that did not worry him. On the contrary, he was prepared. After having known for so many of them during his incursions as a solitary hunter, Florentino Ariza had come to realize that the world was full of happy widows. He had seen them go mad with grief at the sight of their husband's corpse, pleading to be buried alive in the same coffin so they would not have to face the future without him. But as they grew reconciled to the new reality of their new condition, he had seen them rise up from the ashes with renewed vitality. They began by living like parasites of gloom in their big empty houses. They became the confidants of their servants, lovers of their pillows, with nothing to do after so many years of sterile captivity. They wasted their overabundant hours doing what they had not had time for before. Sewing the buttons on dead man's clothes, ironing and re-ironing the shirts with stiff collar and cuffs so they would always be in perfect condition. They continued to put his soap in the bathroom, his monogrammed pillowcase on the bed. His place was always set at the table in case he returned from the dead without warning, as he tended to do in life. But in those solitary masses they began to be aware that once again they were mistresses of their fate, after having renounced not only their family name, but their own identity in exchange for security that was no more than another of a bride's many illusions. They alone knew how tiresome was the man they loved to distraction, who perhaps loved them, but whom they had to continue nurturing until his last breath, as if he were a child suckling him, changing his soiled diapers, distracting him with a mother's tricks to ease his terror at going out each morning to face reality. And nevertheless, when they watched him leave the house, this man they themselves had urged to conquer the world, then they were the ones left with the terror that he would never return. That was their life. Love, if it existed, was something separate, another life. In the restorative idleness of solitude, on the other hand, the widows discovered that the honorable way to live was at the body's bidding, eating only when one was hungry, loving without lies, sleeping without having to feign sleep in order to escape the indecency of official love, possessed at last of the right to an entire bed to themselves, where no one fought them for half of the sheet, half of the air they breathed, half of their night, until their bodies were satisfied with dreaming their own dreams and they woke alone. In the dawns of his furtive hunting, Florentino Ariza would see them coming out of 5 o'clock mass, shrouded in black, and with the raven of destiny on their shoulder. As soon as he spotted them in the light of dawn, he would cross the street to walk on the other side with their small, hesitant steps, the steps of a little bird, for just walking near a man might stain their honor. And yet he was convinced that a disconsolate widow, more than any other woman, might carry within her the seed of happiness. So many widows in his life since the widow Nazareth had made it possible for him to discern how happy they were after the death of their husbands. What had been only a dream until then was changed, thanks to them, into a possibility that he could seize with both hands. He had no reason why Fermina Daza should not be a widow like them, prepared by life to accept him just as he was, without fantasies of guilt because of her dead husband, resolved to discover with him the other happiness of being happy twice, with one love for everyday use, which would become more and more a miracle of being alive, and the other love that belonged to her alone, the love immunized by death, against all contagion. Perhaps he would not have been as enthusiastic if he had even suspected how far Fermina Daza was from those illusory calculations, at a time when she was just beginning to perceive the horizon of a world in which everything was foreseen except adversity. In those days, being rich had many advantages, and many disadvantages as well, of course, but half the world longed for it as the most probable way to live forever. Fermina Daza had rejected Florentino Ariza in a lightning flash of maturity, which she paid for immediately with a crisis of pity, but she never doubted that her decision had been correct. At the time, she could not explain what hidden impulses of her reason had allowed her that clairvoyance, but many years later, on the eve of old age, she uncovered them suddenly and without knowing how, during a casual conversation about Florentino Ariza. Everyone knew that he was heir apparent to the River Company of the Caribbean during its greatest period. They were all sure they had seen him many times, and had even had dealings with him, but no one could remember what he was like. It was then that Fermina Daza experienced the revelation of the unconscious motives that had kept her from loving him. She said, "It is as if he were not a person, but only a shadow." That is what he was, the shadow of someone whom no one ever had known. But while she resisted the siege of Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who was just the opposite, she felt herself tormented by the phantom of guilt, the only emotion she could not bear. When she felt it coming on, a kind of panic overtook her, which she could only control if she found someone to soothe her conscience. Ever since she was a little girl, when a plate broke in the kitchen, when something fell, when she herself caught her finger in the door, she would turn in dismay to the nearest adult and make her accusation. It was your fault. Although in reality she was not concerned with who was responsible or with convincing herself of her own innocence, she was satisfied at having established it. The specter was so notorious that Dr. Urbino realized how it threatened the harmony of his home, and as soon as he detected it, he hastened to tell his wife, "Don't worry, my love, it was my fault," for he had feared nothing so much as his wife's sudden categorical decisions, and he was convinced that they always originated in a feeling of guilt. The confusion caused by her rejection of Florentino Ariza, however, had not been resolved with comforting words. For several months, Fermina Daza continued to open up the balcony in the morning, and she always missed the solitary phantom watching her from the deserted little park. She saw the tree that had been his, the most obscure bench where he would sit to read as he thought about her, suffered for her, and she would have to close the window again, sighing, "Poor man," when it was already too late to make up for the past. She even suffered the disillusionment of knowing that he was not as tenacious as she had supposed, and from time to time she would still feel a belated longing for a letter that never arrived. But when she had to face the decision of marrying Juvenal Urbino, she succumbed in a major crisis when she realized she had no valid reasons for preferring him after she had rejected Florentino Ariza without valid reasons. In fact, she loved him as little as she had loved the other one, but knew much less about him, and his letters did not have the fervor of the other ones, nor had he given her so many moving proofs of his determination. The truth is that Dr. Juvenal Urbino's suit had never been undertaken in the name of love, and it was curious to say the least that a militant Catholic like him would offer her only worldly goods, Security, order, happiness, contiguous numbers that, once they were added together, might resemble love, almost be love. But they were not love, and these doubts increased her confusion because she was also convinced that love was really what she needed to live. Middle of 205. In any case, the principal factor operating against Dr. Juvenal Urbino was his more than suspect resemblance to the ideal man that Lorenzo Daza had so wanted for his daughter. It was impossible not to see him as the creature of a paternal plot, even if in reality he was not, but Fermina Daza became convinced that he was from the time she saw him come to her house for a second, unsolicited medical call. In the end, her conversations with cousin Hildebranda only confused her. Because of cousin Hildebranda's own situation as a victim, she tended to identify with Florentino and Sara, forgetting that perhaps Lorenzo Daza had arranged her visit so that he could use her influence in favor of Dr. Urbino. God alone knows what it cost Fermina Daza not to accompany her cousin when she went to meet Florentino Riza in the telegraph office. She would have liked to see him again, to present him with her doubts, to speak with him alone, to learn to know him well, so that she could be certain that her impulsive decision would not precipitate her into another more serious one, capitulation in her personal war against her father. But that is what she did at a crucial moment in her life, giving no importance whatsoever to the handsomeness of her suitor, or his legendary wealth, or his youthful glory, or any of his numerous virtues. Rather, she was stunned by the fear of an opportunity slipping away, and by the imminence of her 21st birthday, which was her private time limit for surrendering to fate. That one moment was enough for her to make the decision that was foreseen in the laws of God and man. Until death do you part. Then all her doubts vanished. She could accomplish without remorse what reason indicated as the most decent thing to do. With no tears, she wiped away the memory of Florentino Riza. She erased him completely, and in the spaces that he had occupied in her memory, she allowed a field of poppies to bloom. All that she permitted herself was one final sigh that was deeper than usual. Poor man. The most fearful doubts began, however, and she returned from her honeymoon. When she returned from her honeymoon, as soon as they opened the trunks, unpacked the furniture, and emptied the 11 chests she had brought in order to take possession as lady and mistress of the former palace of the Marquis de Casal Duerdo, she realized with mortal vertigo that she was a prisoner in the wrong house, and even worse, with a man who was not. It took her 6 years to leave, the worst years of her life. When she was in despair because of the bitterness of Donna Blanca, her mother-in-law, and the mental lethargy of her sisters-in-law, who did not go to rot in a convent cell only because they had already carried one inside themselves. Dr. Urbino, resigned to paying homage to his lineage, turned a deaf ear to the pleas, confident that the wisdom of God and his wife's infinite capacity to adapt would resolve the situation. He was pained by the deterioration of his mother, whose joy in living had at one time sparked the desire to live in even the most skeptical. It was true, that beautiful, intelligent woman, with a human sensibility not at all common in her milieu, had been the soul and body of her social paradise for almost 40 years. Widowhood had so embittered her that she did not seem the same person. It had made her flabby and sour and the enemy of the world. The only possible explanation for her decline was the rancor she felt because her husband had knowingly sacrificed himself for black rabble, as she used to say, when the only fitting sacrifice would have been to survive for her sake. In any case, Fermina Daza's happy marriage lasted as long as the honeymoon, and the only person who could help her to prevent its final wreckage was paralyzed by terror in the presence of his mother's power. It was he, and not her imbecilic sisters-in-law and her half-mad mother-in-law, whom Fermina Daza blamed for the death trap that held her. She suspected too late that behind his professional authority and worldly charm, the man she had married was a hopeless weakling, a poor devil made bold by the social weight of his family names. Excuse me. She took refuge in her newborn son. She had felt him leave her body with a sensation of relief at freeing herself from something that did not belong to her, and she had been horrified at herself when she confirmed that she did not feel the slightest affection for that calf from her womb that a midwife showed her in the raw smeared with grease and blood with the umbilical cord rolled around its neck. But in her loneliness in the palace, she learned to know him. They learned to know each other, and she discovered with great delight that one does not love one's children just because they are one's children, but because of the friendship formed while raising them. She came to despise anything and anyone who was not him in the house of her misfortune. She was depressed by the solitude, the cemetery garden, the squandering of time in the enormous windowless rooms. During the endless nights, she felt herself losing her mind, as the mad women screamed in the asylum next door. She was ashamed of their custom of setting the banquet table every day with embroidered tablecloths, silver service, and funereal candelabra, so that 5 phantoms could dine on café con leche and crullers. She detested that rosary at dusk, the affected table etiquette, the constant criticism of the way she held her silverware, the way she walked in mystical strides like a woman of the streets, the way she dressed as if she were in the circus, and even the rustic way she treated her husband and nursed her child without covering her breast with her mantilla. When she was issued her first invitations to 5 o'clock tea with little imperial cakes and candied flowers in accordance with recent English fashion, Doña Blanca objected to serving remedies for sweating out a fever in her house instead of chocolate with aged cheese and rounded loaves of cassava bread. Not even dreams escaped her notice. One morning when Fermina Daza said she had dreamed about a naked stranger who walked through the salons of the palace scattering fistfuls of ashes, Doña Blanca cut her off. A decent woman cannot have that kind of dream. Along with the feeling of always being in someone else's house came 2 even greater misfortunes. One was the almost daily diet of eggplant in all its forms, which Doña Blanca refused to vary out of respect for her dead husband, and which Fermina Daza refused to eat. She had despised eggplants ever since she was a little girl, even before she had tasted them, because it always seemed to her that they were the color of poison. Only now she had to admit that in this case something had changed for the better in life, because at the age of 5 she had said the same thing at the table and her father had forced her to eat the entire casserole intended for 6 people. She thought she was going to die, first because she vomited pulverized eggplant, and then because of the cupful of castor oil she had to take as a cure for the punishment. Both things were confused in her memory as a single purgative, as much for the taste as for her terror of the poison, and at the abominable lunches in the palace of the Marquis de Casalduerdo, she had to look away so as to not repay their kindness with the icy nausea of castor oil. The other misfortune was the harp. One day, very conscious of what she meant, Doña Blanca had said, "I do not believe in decent women who do not know how to play the piano." It was an order that even her son tried to dispute, for the best years of his childhood had been spent in the galley slavery of piano lessons. Although as an adult he would be grateful for them. He could not imagine his wife with her character subjected to the same punishment at the age of 25. But the only concession he could wring from his mother, with pure argument that it was the instrument of the angels, was to substitute the harp for the piano. Middle of 208. Almost to the end of this part. There we go. And so, it was that they brought a magnificent harp from Vienna that seemed to be gold and sounded as if it were, and that was one of the most valued heirlooms in the museum of the city, until it and all it contained were consumed in flames. Fermina Daza submitted to this deluxe prison sentence in an attempt to avoid catastrophe with one final sacrifice. She began to study with a teacher of teachers, whom they brought for that purpose from the city of Mompox, who died unexpectedly 2 weeks later, and she continued for several years with the best musician at the seminary, whose gravedigger's breath distorted her arpeggios. She herself was surprised at her obedience, for although she did not admit it in her innermost thoughts, or in the silent arguments she had with her husband during the hours they had once devoted to love, She had been caught up more quickly than she had believed in the tangle of conventions of prejudices of her new world. At first, she had a ritual phrase that affirmed her freedom of thought. To hell with a fan when the wind is blowing. But later, jealous of her carefully won privileges, fearful of embarrassment and scorn, she demonstrated her willingness to endure even humiliation in the hope that God would at last take pity on Doña Blanca, who never tired of begging him in her prayers to send her death. Dr. Urbino justified his own weakness with grave arguments, not even asking himself if they were in conflict with the church. He would not admit that the difficulties with his wife had their origin in the rarefied air of the house, but blamed them on the very nature of matrimony, an absurd invention that could exist only by infinite grace of God. It was against all scientific reason for two people who hardly knew each other, with no ties at all between them, with different characters, different upbringings, and even different genders, to suddenly find themselves committed to living together, to sleeping in the same bed, to sharing two destinies that perhaps were fated to go in opposite directions. He would say, the problem with marriage is that it ends every night after making love, and it must be rebuilt every morning after breakfast. And worst of all was theirs, arising out of two opposing classes and worst of all was theirs. I think that's what they mean. Arising out of two opposing classes in a city that still dreamed of the return of the viceroys. The only possible bond was something as improbable and fickle as love, if there was any, and in their case there was none when they married, and when they were on the verge of inventing it, fate had done nothing more than confront them with reality. That was the condition of their lives during the period of the harp. They had left behind the delicious coincidences of her coming in while he was taking a bath, when despite the arguments and the poisonous eggplant, and despite his demented sisters and the mother who bore them, he still had enough love to ask her to soap him. She began to do it with the crumbs of love that still remained from Europe, and both allowed themselves to be betrayed by memories, softening without wanting to, desiring each other without saying so, and at last they would die of love on the floor, spattered with fragrant suds as they heard the maids talking about them in the laundry room. If they don't have more children, it's because they don't fuck. From time to time, when they came home from wild fiesta, the nostalgia crouching behind the door would knock them down with one blow of its paw. And then there would be a marvelous explosion in which everything was the way it used to be, and for 5 minutes they were once again the uninhibited lovers of their honeymoon. But, except for those rare occasions, one of them was always more tired than the other when it was time to go to bed. She would dawdle in the bathroom, rolling her cigarettes in perfumed paper, smoking alone, relapsing in her consolatory love, as she did when she was young and free in her own house, mistress of her own body. She always had a headache, or it was too hot, always, or she pretended to be asleep, or so had her period again. Her period, always her period. So much so that Dr. Urbino had dared to say in class, only for the relief of unburdening himself, without confession, that after 10 years of marriage, women had their period as often as 3 times a week. Alright, I'm gonna stop there. Middle of 210.